My name is Megan. I'm the business manager for Heigl. I'll be your moderator today. So if you have any questions throughout the panel, feel free to send me a message in the chat and I can try to help you out with any technical difficulties. We're going to use a few different features on Zoom today. So we're going to start out with a couple of quick polls to understand better your experiences. And then Terry will discuss the findings of her research and she'll ask the panelists some direct questions. After that, we'll take a little bit of a break and then you guys will have a chance to ask questions. So be thinking throughout the discussion of what questions you want to ask of our panelists. We're going to use the raise hand icon for that. So if you look in the bottom right corner of your Zoom screen, you'll see a reactions button. And if you click on that, there's a button that says raise hand. So we're going to keep everybody muted throughout the panel just to limit any background noise. And if you just click on that raise hand button, when you would like to ask a question, I will go ahead and unmute you so that you can ask your question of the panelists. If you have any questions, like I said, feel free to put them in the chat. We would love to see your faces. If you don't have your videos on, it just makes it a little bit more interactive and fun. So feel free to do that when you're ready. And we'll go ahead and get started with a couple of polling questions. So I'm going to launch those now and you'll see them come up on your screen. Okay, so our first question, how disruptive was COVID to your organization's strategy? One, hugely disruptive, causing complete restructuring of your business model. Two, moderately disruptive, or three, not disruptive. You can go ahead and click on your answer there and then move on to the next question. All right, I see some answers coming in. Awesome. So our next question, did COVID create new business and or funding opportunities for your organization? And also just so you know, these are anonymous questions. So we're just using the results to kind of gauge where all of your organizations are at. Yes, a few, or no. And then our third question, how important is it to your organization to address racial inequities within the communities you serve? One, very important, two, moderately important, or three, not important at this time. I'll leave that poll open for another minute or so that everybody can have a chance to respond, and then we'll share the results with you. All right, so we had good participation in that. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. And you can see the results here. It looks like we had a large number that said that COVID was moderately disruptive to their organizations. Yes, for new business opportunities, which is great. Hopefully today we can help you giving some more tips and tricks from those panelists that have already learned those new business opportunities that have been created. And then very important to address racial inequities within the communities you serve. So that's also something that we'll talk about today. So thank you so much for participating in the polling. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing this and turn it over to Terry, who is going to give a welcome and introduce our panelists.
Thanks, Megan. Appreciate it. Welcome to everyone. I'm so happy to see you all here today. I'm very fortunate to lead Heigl. We're a team of consultants and coaches. We help mission-driven organizations and their leaders increase social impact in the world, as well as help them generate the revenue they need to sustain it. And I'm super excited today to introduce you to 4 extraordinary CEOs who were very successful in leading their organizations through this most challenging period of the COVID pandemic. Each of their stories is unique, but the thread that I found through all of them was really their personal and organizational commitment to improving racial inequities, not only within their organizations, but within the communities in which they work. And it's great to see that that is such a high priority for many of you. They really inspired me to write the insights paper about their work and what was learned in this period. And you can find a lot more information about their journeys in the paper itself. But today we have the opportunity to speak with them in person, which is so great. And as Megan said, we're going to have the opportunity, a lot of time actually, for questions, relatively speaking. So you'll have a chance to dive deeper into anything that you hear that's really of particular interest to you as we start our discussion. So I'm going to start with the introductions, and I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction for each one so you have some more context for who they are. I'm going to start with Scott Hookman. And Scott is the president of Enterprise Housing Credit Investment, LLC. It's one of the oldest and most successful businesses under the Enterprise Community Partners umbrella. Scott has spent, I would say, most of your career there. Scott, would you say that's right? Partners, the umbrella organization, is one of the country's leading organizations building, investing, and advocating for affordable housing. Last year, in the middle of the pandemic, Scott's organization invested a record-breaking $1 billion in creating and revitalizing affordable housing across the United States, while at the same time committing to a unique and targeted set of goals to dismantle systemic racism within the housing industry. So Scott, I want to thank you so much for being here with us today. And is there anything you'd like to add to what I said?
Well, thanks for having me, Terry. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, great. Thank you, Scott. Next, I want to introduce George Jones. And George is the CEO of an organization called Bread for the City. And Bread provides hunger relief, legal services, healthcare, and other basic services to residents and communities in Washington, D.C. Their clients include folks who have suffered significantly from racial inequities, and as a result include some of the poorest residents in the city, and they're largely African-American, their clients. Bread was pushed very hard to innovate during COVID due to the massive disruptions created by the pandemic. And under George's leadership, the organization never backed down from consistently making decisions through a racial equity lens. This led to some really interesting innovations and how they work, and we're going to explore those with George today. George, thank you so much for being here. Is there anything that you'd like to add?
I guess the only thing I would say, Terry, and maybe to be a little bit bold and audacious, is to say that we at Bread for the City think that we really want to challenge the idea that a rich city like Washington, D.C., or a rich country like the United States really can end poverty, really can eliminate poverty, that is not a pie in the sky idea. And so, I think it's important to say that explicitly. I feel like some of us have gotten, worn out, I guess, by the challenge, but that is really still our belief and premise. So I'm looking forward to the conversation today. Okay,
great. Thank you for sharing that. Next, I'd like to introduce Maurice Jones. No relationship to George, at least that I know of. And Maurice is the former CEO and now board member of the Local Initiative Support Corporation, or LISC, as we like to call it. LISC takes a holistic approach to community building by supporting affordable housing, job and business creation, small business lending, healthcare, job training, quality education, community policing, childcare, financial counseling. Last year, they deployed an amazing $2 billion to meet these needs, with deep investments in the 39 markets where they have a physical presence. During COVID, as small businesses began to fail, especially those owned by people of color, Maurice and LISC were compelled to do something to really make a difference in this area. And this required decisions be made and resources allocated much faster than normal. Maurice found he had to pay particular attention to his relationship with his board to be able to really effectively rise to the challenge. And so we're going to hear a little more about that today from Maurice. I want to thank him also for being here. And Maurice, is there anything you'd like to add?
Nope, nice to be with you. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. And then Ron Pringle is our fourth CEO, and Ron is the CEO of the Interfaith Food Shuttle. He's based here in North Carolina. We're out of Durham, and Ron is based in Raleigh. It's a short walk, run, drive away. He works across 7 counties in the Piedmont region of North Carolina, so spanning both rural and urban communities. His organization has a vision to dismantle hunger at its roots, including the roots of systemic racism. So during COVID, his business model really broke, and their supply chains evaporated. Both his donated food and the commercially purchased food was very difficult to get. Demand for many of their services disappeared, while demand for emergency food assistance skyrocketed. So he and his team had to very quickly reimagine how they were going to meet the nutritional needs of many new food insecure households while still paying attention to eliminating racism within the food system. So how could he do that in a really equitable way? It's a really interesting story, and I want to thank him so much for being here. Ron, is there anything that you'd like to add?
I'm just excited to be a part of the conversations and be surrounded by such great minds. So I'm looking forward to learning with you all today.
Okay, great. Well, thank you guys. So we're going to jump in. And so, George, I'd like to ask you some questions to begin with. Bread uses a racial equity lens, as I mentioned, for every business decision that it makes. And this was especially important during the pandemic when Black and Brown people suffered so disproportionately. You took actions that resulted in improved health and well-being for people of color, but also helped the whole city of Washington, D.C. And I found your story particularly compelling because you essentially, I felt, were really able to make a strong business case for focusing on racial equity and how it could benefit so many people. And I'd love for you just to tell us a little more about how you did this.
Okay, thank you. I think probably the best example that I could point to is how we restructured our healthcare practice. Or you may not know, but Bread for the City provides food, clothing, medical, legal, social services, advocacy, and organizing support to community members here in Washington, D.C. And all of those programs historically have been equally important to our community members, this holistic approach. But of course, during the pandemic, it was a health emergency. And it was in that space, I think, where we really, to put it in your words, made the case to the district government, initially when we started to prioritize both testing and then vaccines, there was a kind of equal treatment to how we did that. So clinics were open to anybody in the community, and we started to see, not surprisingly, a kind of disparity in who showed up. In Bread for the City, who historically serves people of color as patients, we were seeing many more white people for testing, many more white people for the vaccine ultimately. And we certainly didn't begrudge those folks. We served every single one who showed up. But we really did pretty quickly point out to the Department of Health and to the community as a whole that we thought you really have to be, this is why equity is so important. And if you just try to use sort of traditional approaches that sort of say we're going to treat everybody equal, the kind of socioeconomic disparities, the privileges, they all start to show up in terms of who gets access to things. And so we pushed the district government to allow us to get out of the electronic portal that was the framework for people receiving the vaccine, and really allow us to reach out to our community members directly. And we went from seeing 80% of our patients who came for the vaccine who were white, went from 75 to 80% of the people of color started to show up because we prioritized the space. We made the case that it was important. And of course, here in DC, like I think across the country, people of color were being infected at a greater rate, being hospitalized at greater rates, and dying, unfortunately, at much greater rates than anybody else. And, we were all more vulnerable when you had people who were vulnerable to contracting the virus. So it made sense, even though it was the just thing to do because people of color were being affected disproportionately. It also made sense from a healthcare standpoint to have people of color prioritized because they were going to be able to infect other people if we really didn't sort of tackle that reality heads on.
How are you able to sort of flip the dynamic and then start to see more people of color coming into the vaccine?
So we stopped using a digital model. Initially the district used
That was the thing, huh?
where people could go on a portal, and so the digital divide that's the form of privilege that started to show up when we were talking about the vaccine. And so we said you can't just assume that people living on low incomes, people in certain parts of the city who we know have less access to internet and computers, that they're going to be to compete against folks of privilege who have a wide range of access. And sure enough, when we came out of the digital portal and really just started using telephones and our own networks, we started to turn those numbers around.
Interesting. Yeah, really interesting. I have a sense that your way of doing business was part of how Washington, D.C. kept their overall infections rates really below the national average for a long time.
I think so. I think the district was, in the credit to the city, I think that the city was already in tune to the question of equity. And so it was why I was able to move quickly when people started to point out the kinds of negative trends that were showing up in the district. I think really get some credit for moving quickly. The other thing I will say is that, connected to that, we're going to talk about hunger probably more later, but connected to that was this real spike in the need for food to be delivered to folks. And again, these were predominantly people of color. In fact, we saw a real spike in the number of Latinx folks who came to us. Historically, probably about 10% of the folks we were serving in our pantries were Latinx. But I think we saw more like 30 or 40% of the people who called us about the need for food to be folks who were newly sort of food insecure. So that was another thing that we as an organization had to be ready for. And we spent a lot more money serving those additional folks who called us and said they were food insecure.
Tell people how you got food to them.
Yeah, we partnered actually with 3 groups. The biggest one was Amazon, because Amazon was always the biggest group in the room, of course. And Amazon actually partnered with us early on in the pandemic to help us deliver groceries. Historically, our model was and is a food pantry style model where people come to our centers, one here in Northwest DC where I am and the other in Southeast DC, and pick up groceries. But when the pandemic hit, we decided it was important to say that we didn't want people to have to choose between their health and hunger and nutrition. And so we partnered with both Amazon and with local community members in what are called mutual aid networks to distribute groceries. And so probably we went from 10% of the food that we distribute typically being delivered to between 80 and 90% of the grocery bags and food stuff that we distributed was being delivered and still is being delivered during the pandemic.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, and then there's lots and lots of benefits to that, right?
Yeah, one of the things that you're right. One of the things that we realized was that this was more equitable, even if it hadn't been a pandemic. But we're talking about people again with low incomes, and so the fact that they were using their own monies to get to our pantries, I don't think we'd ever really sort of calculated the kind of net gain that they were getting, because you take the cost of the food and you have to subtract what are the costs of the transportation before you really know what the value added is. And so when we were doing the deliveries to people, effectively they were getting 100% of the value of the food that we gave them.
What's their time back?
And their time back. So you're right.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, George. Thanks for sharing. Okay, well, we're gonna move on to Scott. And so you can see we've got a real variety of organizations here that are working on at different levels, right? So George is very local. Scott works on a national level. And Scott, you experienced rapid growth in your core syndication business model this year. That is matching investor capital with well underwritten affordable housing projects where they were needed most. And you deployed, as I said, over $1 billion last year doing that, which is just amazing. So my question is, given this really explosive growth, can you share with us how you manage that while at the same time seriously committing to broader social impact goals around racial justice? I'm curious how you integrate them, and if your fast growth of your syndication business if you ever feel it is competing with your goals around racial justice and impact. And please feel free also to share some of those social impact goals, because I think they're really interesting around the housing industry.
Sure. Well, that's a great question. I think there's no, we're all, I think, dealing with competing goals every day, right? In whatever organization we're in. And so to say, oh yeah, there's no tension there, just isn't realistic. I think the answer there probably is true for others as well, is that we're all part of something bigger, and that may be at the community level or in the organizational level. And so I oversee one of our businesses that's involved with financing affordable housing development. It's part of a larger organization that sort of is keeping us honest, right, and keeping us focused. But I think one thing that in thinking about that question, Terry, is that and I'll come back to the second part of your question in a second, but in implementing various aspects of Enterprise's strategic plan that may be pushing us in some new directions. One question or decision is, do you have that off to the side somewhere where you might have maybe you hire specific staff people to focus on that strategic priority, such as advancing racial equity in what we're doing. Our concern with that was that then it kind of gets pushed off to the side potentially. I mean, the upside is that you have somebody who's really focusing on it. The downside is if it gets kind of marginalized. And so, as we think about, what we're doing, I want the people that are sort of, doing our regular business to be embracing this, and not have it be, oh, well, that person over there is responsible for this, I'm not. Because then it does become, it doesn't really enter the mainstream. Yeah, it doesn't kind of enter the mainstream of what we do. I think that by going that route, then we do run the risk, though, that people are all juggling, a lot of competing demands every day. And so, does doing something that's a little different that requires, stretching and adapting, does that end up getting pushed to the side? And that's where I think, it's partly I see my responsibility and, the sort of oversight of the larger organization to make sure that we're not this isn't just falling by the wayside. And just to give a little more context, so Enterprise as a whole rolled out a new strategic plan. It was last year. It was actually pretty much developed by the beginning of last year, so prior to COVID. And prior to all the other things that happened last year, and we set out 3 sort of organization-wide goals. One being to increase the supply of affordable housing, which is sort of what we've always done. But the second one, which was a new thing to prioritize at this level, was to advance racial equity. and the third is to advance resilience and upward mobility for residents. And so we, Enterprise has programs and work that we're doing on the ground in our various areas around the country. We've got financial tools like the one that I work with to finance and build affordable housing. We own and operate our own affordable housing in the Mid-Atlantic area. And so the idea with the strategic plan is that those three overarching goals are ones that all the different parts of Enterprise are expected to contribute to. And on the racial equity piece specifically, the one that we've decided to focus on first is really on who is doing affordable housing development, which has been, for many years, very, very predominantly, almost exclusively, companies and organizations that are white-led and owned, and so we've put in place an organization-wide initiative to really try to disrupt that status quo, and put in place both financial tools and supports and services and kind of wraparound support to really broaden the base over time of who's getting resources to build and operate affordable housing. And so that's really where this kind of intersects with what I do and my group does, in terms of who are what's the base of the developers that we're partnering with to get their affordable housing built around the country. And so it's a good example where of your question, where if someone who's out there originating their next deal, if there's a developer they've already done 5 deals with and just kind of cranking them out, it's very easy to just work with that developer to do their next deal versus someone who might be doing their first project and who is still figuring out kind of how it all comes together. So that's where we really are pushing it through to individuals' goals, to say, yeah, you actually need to prioritize this, and so we're early on. I think it's something that we are committed to seeing through, but we're not. I'm not naive about how challenging it will be over time to deliver the results that we are holding ourselves to.
Thank you, Scott. I think that's really a great example of diversifying the developer pool, and how do you actually do that on the ground? What does that look like? I'm sure you're going to learn a lot, going through that process. And I hope it's something that you guys will share, publicly, because I think many companies could benefit from what you learn. I think part of it also is not holding ourselves to perfectionism.
What?
I know you're perfect
Me?
every other way. But I think especially in this conversation around racial equity, the efforts aren't going to be perfect necessarily the first time around. But so just being able to acknowledge that and being open and trying and really learning from our mistakes seems like very important. But thank you. I love that you guys are they have some other really interesting goals. I encourage people, especially that have a housing background, to read the paper and learn more about that. really interesting goals in dismantling racism within the housing system, and clearly you've given it a lot of thought. Well, thank you. Thank you, Scott. You may get some more questions around that in the follow-ups from our participants. So we're going to move to Ron. And again, Ron is the food shuttle, the CEO of the Interfaith Food Shuttle. And as I mentioned, Ron is unique in this group in that his business model broke. I don't think that any of the other three would say that their business models broke in COVID. So they had no more backpacks to fill, no more folks to train in the culinary arts. All the restaurants they closed. No more volunteers to run their urban farm. A huge decline in food donations. So a lot of that came from workplaces, which were also closed. And at the same time, they experienced this meteoric rise in demand from newly food insecure people. So you can read the insights paper and really see how Ron made some big shifts in his business model to accommodate these massive changes in the environment and actually grow their operations last year. But what I want to ask, what I really want to ask Ron about is the topic of fear. And because, right, you're facing this kind of disruption, how were you able to handle fear in that moment, like within yourself, within your team? I'm curious of what did you lean on? What drove your decisions at that point?
That's a great question, and thanks, Terry. Yeah, it was absolutely a frightening time, and everything that you were, used to and kind of build your models after, it was just all of a sudden interrupted. Having done this work for a while, it's become easy to kind of predict and project what's going to happen, where you're going to be, whether that's in how much funds you're going to raise this year or how much food you're going this year, all of your plans and projections of how you're going to scale your programs, to all of a sudden being in an environment where we had no idea what was going to happen next. And one of the things that I think we did was went back to our core mission and looking back at our mission statement and really trying to understand who we were. What was our work? What was our role? And that kept a moment. And so by not losing our heads and staying in the moment, we were able to go back to that core mission statement, pioneering innovative and transformative solutions to end hunger. Pioneering and being innovative. So we had to look at how can we be creative? The organization, Jill Bullard and Maxine Solomon that founded this organization, founded it based off of it was a need that they saw in their community with their neighbors, and they came up with a solution, and that birthed the organization. And so in the moment, we were able to look and see, this is the need that our community has. Now, how can we be creative in meeting this need? And so the rise in the need for food went through the roof. Well, how can we be creative and being able to do that? And also be safe in this particular environment. So our team had to look at, how do we increase and expand our distribution models and do it in a safe manner? So we were able to model drive-through distributions where individuals did not have to get out their cars. They didn't have to have any type of interactions. And we were able to just put the supplies that they need in the trunk of their cars. And as you program, just totally gone with kids being at home, they still needed that meal. There were so many on free and reduced lunch that rely on that school lunch program, as in many cases as their only meals that they get throughout the day. And so how can our culinary program and our kitchen now be better served, instead of the training model, which there's no one to train right now, but what do we do with these meals? How can we prepare these meals and how do we get them distributed? And so it took creative partnerships and partnering with the school district to say, hey, we have a solution. Here is what we bring to the table. We have a kitchen, we can prepare these meals. Here are the barriers. Help us work through this. And they were a part of that solution by coming up with different distribution models, utilizing their bus systems. They knew exactly where the food needed to go. And so they established hubs for that food to be delivered. And as that began to scale, our kitchen, we outgrew our capacity. So once again, the need was we had more kids, but we've outgrown our capacity.
Mm.
So how do we once again be creative? Well, partnering with our county. We had so many local restaurants that their doors were closed. They were unable to pay their employees, laying people off. Well, how can we make this a win-win situation? So how do we access the resources that we have? I don't have to build and expand my kitchen with those resources. There are several restaurants that have kitchens. There are several restaurants that have staff and people that we want to get back to work. So why can't they be producing these meals? So we partner with maybe 10 local restaurants, and that helped them to be able to stay afloat and keep their employees working throughout the pandemic, all while providing meals to all of the children that were home in school, out of school. So we had to stay in the moment to be able to see those opportunities as they came.
Mm.
And you can't live in a moment in a place of fear, staying in the moment.
That's so
you have to face
interesting.
it.
Yeah, that being in the present moment and fear you can't have both. Yeah.
Cannot occupy the same space.
Can't occupy the same space. I think that's a huge observation. Right? Because what we see often when circumstances are changing, of course, COVID was like a crazy circumstance, but circumstances are always changing anyway, right? Whether we're in a pandemic or not. And I think it's so easy for us as leaders to like feel that wave of fear, right? Like the next thing that's changing, the next person that quits, the next funder that doesn't want to fund us anymore, whatever it is. And that, the fear can be just so disabling for folks, right? And what you're saying is grounding in actually the present moment of what's happening to be able to see what the next step is.
Yeah, absolutely. And recognizing that you can't do it all yourself.
Mm.
You don't have to be the one-stop solution to everything. This is what your partners are for. Your community is for. It's about community taking care of community. And some people just really don't know what to do or how to help until someone stands up and say, you know what, here's a thought, here's an idea, here's what we can bring to the table.
Mm.
And that gives them an opportunity to say, you know what, if you bring this, here is what I have.
We can solve it
And
together.
then it took a lot of education for our donors, because it was a shift with our donors that were so used to supporting something that was programmatic, that had a lot of outputs. What's the pounds? What's the number of people instead of the outcomes? How are these people's lives how are they being changed? And it forced us, and George mentioned that we were seeing the inequities in Black and Brown communities and how disproportionately COVID was affecting those communities. And it made us relook at our models and realize our distribution model is not a one size fit all. I just don't pack one box and everyone receive that same box. So we began to look at more culturally diverse produce, more culturally diverse foods. So if we're going into a particular community, we're taking food that we know they are going to consume. So that helped reduce our food waste. That helped improve the impact that what we were giving were having on these families, because we were giving them food that they knew they could use.
Yeah.
And so that really changed our model from, I would love to order a tractor trailer load of sweet potatoes at 40,000 pounds because it looks good if I distribute 40,000 pounds.
Mm,
But what good is it if 20,000 pounds of it that went to Hispanic community can't be utilized because no one eats it?
mm, mhm. Yeah, very
So
good example.
changes our model, and we have to educate our donors on how do we meet this change, because food are more expensive when you're looking at providing culturally diverse options for individuals.
Mhm. But there's big benefits to that. Yeah. Thank you, Ron. Thank you. Very thought-provoking. Okay. So we're the last kind of formal questions from me are I'm going to direct to Maurice. And not everyone may realize that over 40% of Black-owned businesses in the New York Federal Reserve District shut down during the first 3 months of the pandemic. 90% had less than 3 weeks cash on hand, while white businesses had 2.5 times that. And this dynamic was really repeated all over the country, greatly intensifying the impact of COVID on small minority business owners due to the lack of access to capital. Maurice, you and LISC really took a leadership role in starting to address this gap, in addressing it. And LISC last year was able to rapidly deploy over $200 million to over 3,000 small businesses, 90% of whom were Black and brown or female owned and could not easily access capital elsewhere, while simultaneously doing all of your other support work in communities. So I wanted to ask you today about the reshuffling and reallocation of resources that was required for that kind of effort. And in particular, how that impacted your relationship with your board of directors and your communication with them. And tell us a little bit about that process and how you managed it.
So in terms of the reallocation of resources, at the beginning of COVID, the beginning of the recession, we launched a relief and recovery fundraising effort. And our initial intention was to raise funds for a multiplicity of relief and recovery needs, rent abatement, small business assistance, capacity or immediate relief for nonprofit partners and the folks that they were serving. And it became pretty clear to us very early on that a category of enterprises that was really being underserved were small businesses. Small businesses, by the way, who didn't have these regular ongoing relationships with financial institutions such that they could benefit, frankly, from PPP and other efforts that the federal government was launching. So we chose to really focus on providing some immediate grant relief to these businesses because, frankly, they also were not in a position to accept more debt. Mm-hmm. So we found that we were able to really inspire people to actually invest in our rapid relief and recovery fund with the intention of it going to small businesses. And then even further, we found that we really could get folks to focus on small businesses led by people of color, women, who small businesses in rural areas, and small businesses who were not benefiting from PPP. So we quickly raised over $200 million. We had one business alone, Lowe's, who made a $60 million grant to us for this purpose. And so it was an incredible stepping up amongst folks who really understood what was happening to small businesses. Internally, it meant that we had to have a multidisciplinary team working on this. We had to have local offices working on this. We had to have our small business, and we called it our economic development shop working on this. We had to have our finance people. We had to have legal. So it was an all hands on deck enterprise that certainly required people to work around the clock at this. In addition to this, I was in constant communication with our board. In fact, what the board did was we created a weekly standing meeting of the executive committee of the board to keep them apprised of what we were doing throughout the entirety of the year 2020 from March onward. Remote work and small business work and all the rest. And so what you found was this was just an all hands on deck year for us, 2020. And a big piece of it was what we were trying to do to keep small business. We made $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 and $25,000 grants to businesses all around the country. And as you mentioned, over 90% of them were led by people of color. And these were businesses not served adequately by the mainstream financial institutions and frankly, by the government programs like PPP that were coming down. So we were delighted to be positioned to be able to be useful, and even more delighted that our existing investors stepped up to invest grant dollars on behalf of these enterprises, and someone like Lowe's, with whom we had not done any work with prior to COVID, stepped up and invested $60 million for this purpose. That happened throughout 2020, and it was definitely a big endeavor and a all hands on deck endeavor.
Hey, thank you. I feel like you seeded many follow-up questions in your response, so I appreciate that. We're gonna move to a little break. We're slightly behind schedule. So why don't we'll take a little bit of a break, bio break for folks, and maybe come back at what do we think, Megan? How about
3:57.
3:57. Thank you. We'll come back at 3:57. Come with your questions. I want somebody to ask Maurice about silos, because he works for a big organization, and I'm just curious how much that effort helped to dissolve silos that might have been there before. So anyway, if somebody likes that question, you can ask it. But it's time for you guys to ask questions, and we'll be back at 57. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Thanks for coming back. We are going to open it up to your questions now. So please use the raise hand function that Megan talked about if you can find the reaction button, and the raise hand will be should come up right underneath it. Megan will unmute you, so you don't have to worry about that. If you have any questions for our panelists, so you can ask a specific person if you'd like, or open it up generally to the audience, or to the panelists. people a minute. Megan, can you see if you have questions?
All right, George, thank you for your hand. I think you're unmuted now. You go ahead and ask your question, George.
Well, first and foremost, this is my first time meeting another George Jones, more famous than the George Jones I knew. So, and this is exciting. But my question is really to the panel, not to anyone specific. In your changes or your adaptive changes during COVID, how was the board? What type of relationship did you all find with your board? One, going remotely, and obviously you all have essential workers. But how did you make decisions on which organization members would be working in their capacity on deck, and then which ones would be going remotely? And then what were some of the concerns you and the board had in terms of modifying or adapting your operational activities?
I'll start if you want. Look, on the remote piece, the whole company went remote. We decided to just do our work remotely, with the caveat that we had folks who, for a time at least, visited the offices and picked up the mail. You know, we were getting checks and stuff like that from folks. So we wanted to pick up the checks, but we made a decision that we were going to go remote across the country. And then, you know, it shows you how naive I was when we first decided to go remote. I said, okay, so, you know, we will revisit this remote question every 3 weeks. And I thought, you know, this will go on for 30 days and then we'll be back in the office. That's what I told the board. I was like, well, this will be on for 30 days and then we'll be back in the office, right? So one of the many things that I predicted that did not turn out to be accurate. The board relationship for us, you know, our board, we're a financial institution. And so we had loans out in the market. We had equity-like investments out in the market. And the board was quite concerned that we do everything we could to be on top of our risk with respect to our financings, right? Because that's where our biggest risk was. So we went through a process with the board of reassessing what our lending criteria were going to be. We went through quite an extensive discussion with the board about how we were going to stay on top of the current portfolio as well as a new exposure. It was hands-on, literally. We met with the executive committee every week, and a piece of that meeting always was, okay, let's review the portfolio. Who's asking for forbearance? Whose loans are you pushing back? Tell me what the portfolio looks like. What's going on with delinquencies? You know, we were really managing that portfolio closely. And then in addition to that, we were talking about, okay, here's where we're seeing the places where we can best add value in new investments, in new technical assistance. So it really became, to the point I made early, it really became quite an ongoing checking in with the executive committee of what is a large board. We have plus 20 people on the board. So we couldn't do that with all 20 people, but with a half a dozen, we did that weekly throughout 2020.
I'll continue that a little bit there. As far as the board relationship and how that went about, I actually started the onboarding process and coming on to the Interfaith Food Shuttle right at the beginning of this. And so while much of the interview process was scheduled for in-person, interviews, it quickly went remote. So to be honest, I still have about 70% of my board that I have yet to meet in person. And so, but, you know, it was really, as Maurice said, keeping them informed of what was going on and making sure I understood clearly what their concerns were, especially surrounding the staff. Having gone through several natural disasters and hurricanes, you know what resources you need internally within the organization. And you know the importance of those roles, because it was very important that our transportation kept food moving. It was very important that we had individuals to help with packing and preparing food internally. And so we looked at various roles that could be remote to thin the office out. We made those decisions. And to thin the office out, we look at how can we put people on a rotation so that we had less people in the office. And then being mindful of the staff needs, their concerns, and addressing some of those by bringing on temp workers to sanitize and keep the place clean daily, made people felt more comfortable being able and being in that space. But also implementing and following strict CDC guidelines internally, with ensuring that we weren't doubling up in offices, ensuring that we were wearing masks, special places. And then monitoring that progress and holding people accountable. So not only did we say you're required to sanitize your office twice a day, there was a tracking log where we required them to do that so we can hold accountable. We were putting forth the effort to do that. Instituting temperature checks for our staff and for National Guard members that we were able to bring in to assist us. So there were special protocols that we put in place to make sure that, number one, the staff felt comfortable enough that they come to work and be present and do their jobs.
Thank you for sharing, Ron. I'm going to go ahead and jump in for another question. If there aren't any other hands raised at the moment, feel free to go ahead and click your raise hand button whenever you have a question, and we'll just call on you in order. So as a leader, how did you stay on the leading edge of innovation as we move towards more normal times? How are you staying on the leading edge of innovation?
I think I'll take a shot at that. I think that I've always known that, at least in the work that I do and we do and with my team, that sort of the people that we have, our team is sort of, that's the business, right? That's sort of all we have. You know, it's it's you know, good people to coming together. And so so I think that, you know, it's not a new thing to be very focused on, you know, what people's needs are, how they're feeling about you know, the overall situation. You know, there was a lot of new stresses this brought. You know, we have a lot of folks with, you know, young kids were suddenly, you know, the kids are home, not in school, the childcare is shut down, and then yeah, like Maurice, you know, except for the property management folks on the property side of our organization, you know, everyone went remote. So all of a sudden, it's like, do all this, you know, raise and educate your kids and work you know, your full-time plus job, you know, and then you're completely you can't like check in physically, you know, you're not seeing people, right? So it's like, what's really going on? You know, are people like, you know, gonna go off the edge here? I think that that's something that I kind of think about, well, what will endure out of this? You know, there's a lot of predictions. Oh, people won't work in offices anymore, and the commercial real estate's going down the tubes. You know, people will never travel again. They'll just meet remotely. I mean, I think that it's going to take a while to sort out what things will be enduring and what are sort of transitory. And I think that a lot of things that people, you know, made predictions about will be sort of permanent changes to, you know, our economy or whatever. It's like, yeah, well, we'll see, you know, because there's constant change and adaptation going on. But I think so what about our organizations should endure? And one of them is, you know, just like even more focused than ever on you know, the well-being of our team, of our people, and then finding new ways. You know, is there going to be sort of, you know, what is changing about how people come together? You know, whether they're working more remote going forward or not. I think the other thing is just it not only taught us that we needed to adapt quickly, but also that people and systems are more adaptable than maybe we thought, or more quickly adaptable. There's probably in all of our different organizations things like, well, this is how it has to be done, right? And you know, this is, you know, you have to, you know, our investors are requiring us to go out and see every property we've invested in each year. Just you know, it's a given, right? Well, that requirement went straight out the window, right? You know, everything had to be done remote. And so, you know, and even, you know, thinking of what Ron was saying about, you know, like saying, oh, well, culturally appropriate food, or delivering food, instead of, you know, saying, well, here, you know, this is the model. You come to this location, this food pantry, whatever, and then you pick up food and take it away. I think it's pretty, it's kind of fascinating and kind of encouraging just how you know, organizations and people and communities kind of like adapted when, you know, when they were under pressure to do that.
Yeah, I want to piggyback off the idea of, I think it can't be said. Scott makes maybe one of the most important points about this pandemic that I hope we all remember, which is suddenly organizations were able to do things they thought they couldn't do, were willing to do things much faster. That was really powerful. I hope we sustain that level of agility and flexibility and open-mindedness, because that was really refreshing to me. That unfortunately we had to have a pandemic to create that kind of flexibility among people, but it certainly allowed us to shift and transform our work much faster than we thought. And I think one of the great examples of that for us at Bread for the City was, and it was actually happening all over the country, is, you know, there's this sort of narrative about people with low incomes and people that we sometimes call poor, that they can't be trusted with money, or that they don't deserve money, or that they will waste money. And so funders historically have been really resistant. It's one of the reasons they like to give the money to the nonprofits. They can trust the nonprofits, but we can't trust people who live in poverty. But during the pandemic, there were any number of cash transfers or initiatives that came up across the country. We partnered with some local nonprofits here in DC to do a $4 million cash transfer initiative, where we literally gave people with low incomes money. We gave them $5,500 all at one time, just to be sort of a financial buffer to help elevate their sort of economic floor during the pandemic. It turned out, as Maurice said, it turned out the pandemic lasted a lot longer than we thought. And so the $5,500 didn't go as far as we thought, but nobody ran off to Vegas, and we didn't, there were not, people did what you and I would do with those dollars. They paid their rent, they made sure their children had food to eat, they used the dollars to care for their families. And it was interesting because there were foundations and donors who historically would have never been comfortable with using their dollars that way, but some of them were calling us to say, I want to be a part of that. I want to give dollars to people who we know are hurting more than most during this period. And so that was, I don't know if you want to call that an innovation, but that was certainly a revelation, I think, for those of us working in this space.
George, have you thought more about how you'll keep that adaptation mindset going as we kind of get back to quote unquote normal, because clearly it was a huge shock that kind of pushed us into dealing more with reality, right? And what people actually needed. And how do we maintain that?
I'm optimistic. Maybe one of the things that helps us is how long the pandemic has lasted. We've had to exercise those muscles for quite a while now, and maybe still a little bit longer if, with these variants that are out there, that we maybe still need for us to be both sort of careful, but also, thoughtful about how we move forward. So that may be a little bit of our saving grace. But I think those of us in the space, maybe the more important answer, I've been thinking about this as recently as this morning. Those of us in this space have to seize this opportunity to ferment these reforms to how we do our work. We have to be the ones to really make sure we keep it. We have to, there's a door of opportunity, a window of opportunity. We have to be the ones that start to do business this way, start to set the expectations that we will be flexible, that funders will be, funders streamline their grant making processes. They got money to us faster. They trusted us. They required fewer reports. They let us give dollars directly to community members. And we need to sort of continue to hold them to those sort of changes they made, those kinds of changes, because those are the kinds of things we've needed for a while. And I think I was really impressed with Mari's talking about the $60 million. And we need large scale contributions and investments. If we're going to really end poverty, we need dollars and more on that scale. And so I think the leaders in our sector have to be the ones to keep championing that now and post the pandemic. I think that's a message we need to carry.
Megan, it looks like we had a question in the chat.
Yeah, so first, Dana wanted to ask a question, so I went ahead and muted him. So if you want to go ahead, Dana, and then I do have a question from Margaret as well.
Thanks, Megan. So I was, first of all, great insight from everybody. I was thinking during the conversation, I remember a very smart person asking me a couple years ago, pre-pandemic, pre-BLM, what does diversity mean to you? And, I would say for me at that time, my thought process had depth, but not breadth to it. And I think about how I have evolved as a leader with my changing views the past year. And I'd be very interested from specifically both Maurice and Scott, how have your views personally changed over the past year? And then second, how do you think that's made you a stronger leader of the large, diverse organizations you work with?
So I'll jump in to start with. Look, I think what I came to appreciate much more during the pandemic, recession, racial reckoning of 20 was the need for me as a leader to make sure I was creating an environment within my company for people to grieve, to discuss, to learn, to bring all of who they are into the work environment. The pain, the joy, the need for us to really, as a leader, understand and lead more with heart and soul than before. I think the expectations of leadership now, particularly with respect to all the things that people are trying to juggle outside the quote unquote office and within, I came to appreciate more during that time, that I, as a leader, had to make sure that people knew that they had the permission to cry on the job, so to speak, and that was something that we were going to embrace, and we were going to give people space for, and we were going to internalize in our DNA. 2020 really stressed for me how important it was as a leader to set that tone, to cultivate that culture, and to sustain it with my teammates. And look, I'm somebody who before that had been taught time and time again that the last thing you want to do as a Black man is to bring your soul into the workforce. And I'm just going to be blunt with you all. And so here I am now as a Black man who is a leader, recognizing that, oh no, in fact, I have to make sure that I do it and make sure that other people understand that that's what I expect of them as leaders too. And so I must confess that I think that piece was a gift. I'm so grateful for that, because we became closer as a team than we had ever been at LISC, because we did establish space for people to share their journeys, share their pains, share their fears, share their expectations, and work. And so that piece has stayed with me, and that piece has added to the things that I believe should be on our jobs to be done as leaders, if that stuff makes sense. I may have completely confused you with all of that, but it's it was really the strengthening of the heart muscle and my need to do that. For me, that was the lesson of 2020.
Thank you.
Thanks, Maurice. And that leads perfectly into our next question. Margaret wrote in with a question. We learned that we could give way more options to people, and our clients adapted just fine to uploading documents, etc. I'd be interested to know, what was the best thing that happened to you because of the pandemic experience? Ron or George, do you guys have a response for that question? What was the best thing that happened to you because of the pandemic?
The best thing. Well, one of the things that we did more of is work closely with community members on solutions. I mean, we'd always been trying to do that. That's a part of the equity work, centering community members in the solutions. But I think during the pandemic, and me personally, I probably met more community members personally and talked to them and worked with them on their particular issues. Some of that was because we only had maybe 30% of our staff on site. And so, many of us were wearing 4 or 5 hats. And so me talking to somebody about some programmatic thing was much more commonplace during the pandemic. But I also thought it really demonstrated to me that people wanted that kind of access to leadership and maybe the power of the organization, and that they had meaningful things to say about, how Bread could be more helpful and what we could do for them, particularly during this difficult time. So that was very meaningful to get my hands dirty in that kind of way, to be quite frank.
Yeah, I would add, one of the best things that happened to us, but I can't help but to say thank you, Maurice. Well said. I really wish more people would understand that internal struggle as an African-American leader during this time, in a state where the large percentage of owners don't look like me and don't all understand what's going on. And so in that, the best thing that happened to us and our organization was I took advantage of the moment. As George mentioned, we were able to get so much done so fast, and we want to be able to keep that momentum, and when we implemented certain things, we didn't realize the pandemic was going to last so long. I'm grateful that it did, because I took advantage of that moment, because we're in a different state of mind. There was so much more open, there was so much more flexible, there was so much more giving. And we took that opportunity to launch our strategic. Because if we're going to plan how we're going to move forward together and address what we're seeing in the right now, let's put this on. Let's create this 5-year plan so we can commit ourselves to where we're going. Because a lot of times after the pandemic is over, after waters recede, jobs open back up, people forget those things that were so important just a few months ago, like it never happened. And so we took advantage of that. And we not only involved our staff, but we involved our board. We involved our major donors. We involved our individual donors, our volunteers, our clients in that process, because we wanted all of them to commit to growing from this moment, whether that's addressing whatever social and systemic barriers that addresses our pathway and developing objectives to continue to be innovative, whether that's putting ourselves in a position to whereas we can be flexible and agile to meet, and walking forward with the power and authority to say no. And so I can't wait until we release this plan, because that plan gives us just that authority. It gives us the authority to say yes for things that are in our lane, things that are in our mission, and no for the not, so that we can stay focused and continue to work in that state of urgency. So that was the best thing that happened to us, I believe.
Thank you for that thoughtful answer, Ron. I think we have time for just one more very quick question. George has had his hand raised for a little while. So George Jones, did you have another question for us?
I'm going to make it really, really quick. This is just a comment/question. The comment is this, and I think Maurice and Ron articulated this very well. In this moment, as African-American, Black-led organizations or leaders within organizations, one of the things I just want to ask all of you in this moment is, we hear a lot about this model of food charity versus food sovereignty. And we're moving towards food sovereignty through an integrational process. But I guess what I'm really trying to figure out in this moment, with the supply chain as broken as it was during the pandemic, how do we address systematically, how do we develop a pathway forward related to food sovereignty? How do we give agency to BIPOC communities and farmers and organizations to have ownership in the food distribution process, as well as in the commercialization of operations. And this is just a comment, but my thoughts to you all are all on the battlefield, if you will. Has there been any conversations around building agency for Black and Brown communities?
That's a great point there, George. And very quickly, it's something that was at our core with Interfaith Food Shuttle, and that's empowering individuals, equipping them and giving them the tools and putting them on a pathway to self-sufficiency. And so in that particular lane, we actually operate a 14-acre farm where we're growing diverse foods. We also have community gardens in some of the most impoverished communities, and encourage that community to take ownership of that garden. And so as a part of our strategy, that's a model that we want to scale up. And in the model, we're not looking to hire additional staff to do that. We're looking to bring on someone from that community to maintain that project for that community. And then we serve as a resource for them. And so that's how we painted our model to scale up. And so when it comes to types of programs that we are trying to implement, we always look for what is the community's responsibility, what is the neighbor's investment in this, because that's what makes it self-sustaining.
You know, for a while, I've been wanting Ron and George to meet, and you guys need to have a long conversation about that, because I know how passionate both of you are about it. So I'm going to make that connection again between the two of you guys. I'm afraid we need to stop here because it's 4:30 and I want to respect people's time. But man, wow, what a beautiful discussion today. I just so appreciate all of the questions and all of the panelists being here. We're going to send out an email, and we'll send you a link to the paper as well as a recording of what happened today. You'll get a recording. So please feel free to share that with others. And also an offer to you all that are here today. You know, if in the next 60 to 90 days, you're looking to, one, embed innovation and growth into your organization's business model, as we've heard today. Two, make the business case for improving racial equity. Or three, you want to really clarify the lessons that your organization learned during COVID and really more intentionally figure how you're going to pull those forward with you, right? And there's some really good examples of how these leaders are doing that. You know, if you would like to have a discussion around how to tailor that to your organization, either through some kind of internal roundtable or just a discussion to help you think through that, I want to offer that to you so that we can all move forward together in this new world and really meet the challenges that exist. So with that, we're going to sign off. Thank you again to the panelists. You know, thank you so much for being here, for your time, and like for the 9 months of time you gave me, letting me interview you endlessly for the paper. I so appreciate it, and I hope you have a sense that that effort will really benefit others from today. So
awesome.
thank you.
Thanks, everyone.